So thanks for joining, everyone. On behalf of the NYU Center for International Cooperation and their partners at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of the Netherlands, UN OCHA's Center for Humanitarian Data and Tech Change, I want to welcome you to this session of the Emerging Technologies in Peacebuilding and Prevention, Lessons Learned from Humanitarian Actors workshop. I'm Nikita Jopra, and I'm a senior manager on the Patrick J. McGovern Foundation's Data and Society team, where I primarily focus on strategy and partnerships for our Accelerator program, which is a 9-month grant partnership centered on bringing the best data tools and expertise found in the private sector to nonprofits interested in exploring advanced analytics and data management practices. It's therefore my pleasure today to serve as a moderator for our session this afternoon, which is focused on best practices for providing and securing data in humanitarian crisis situations, specifically on the role of the private sector in partnerships. One quick update to today's agenda is that due to unforeseen circumstances, Rina Amiri, a senior fellow at the NYU Center for International Cooperation, will not be able to join us. However, we are looking forward to future opportunities to engage with her and her valuable perspective on recent events in Afghanistan and the impact of donor and tech-driven work on safe pathways for using data in vulnerable conflict settings. We do, however, have 2 enthusiastic speakers with us today, Laura McGorman, the Data for Good Policy Lead at Meta, and Rakesh Bharani, the Director of Humanitarian and Impact Data at Salesforce.org. They are ready to share their thoughts and experience with the various roles tech companies can play in assisting humanitarians, including with regard to the safest, most responsible ways to provide and secure data in crisis and fragile situations. After we give them both some time to introduce themselves and their work, we'll move into a fireside-style chat. I want to encourage everyone in the audience to participate by asking you to share your questions in the chat. We'll be tracking them and we'll do our best to answer as many of them as possible as time permits. Another quick reminder that today's session is being recorded, and while we will be conducting the session in English, it is also being translated into both French and Spanish today. So for now, I'd like to turn it over to our speakers to begin their introductions, and maybe we can start with Laura.
Thanks so much, Nikita, and it's great to be here. So my name is Laura McGorman. I work at Meta, which was previously known as Facebook. I'm still getting used to the new name, so I can completely appreciate if you are too. And I've actually been leading a team called Data for Good there for about 4 years. Just for a little bit of my own personal story, I'm a development economist by training. I started my career at USAID for 4 years, working in malaria control. I've also done tours of duty at the World Bank and the US Department of Commerce. And I found my way to Facebook really out of a desire to use the world's richest data set to try to solve some of the planet's most pressing problems. And our portfolio has really grown since I started work in this area in 2017. So our program started with a modest set of partners working on issues related to natural disaster response with a set of tools called disaster maps. We evolved to use a lot of data that was really based on sort of population movement. In the context of natural disasters, we were trying to understand real-time analytics related to things like evacuations. And then in 2019, we expanded that work into a set of tools called disease prevention maps that was using the same core set of mobility statistics, but to try to forecast diseases. And what was really interesting about that was that when we launched disease prevention maps in 2019, we thought, maybe this will be really useful for flu forecasting or trying to better understand the progress of measles outbreaks in different parts of the world with low vaccination rates. Of course, little did we know there was a global pandemic headed our way. And so starting in early 2020, we have been incredibly busy and very much focused on tools for COVID-19 response. Not the least of which has focused on, again, mobility data to this time understand yet another set of insights much more related to stay-at-home policy effectiveness, as well as sort of the rates of physical distancing at a population level, as well as pretty novel tools. We have a pretty bespoke data set that we've released in the last couple of years called the Social Connectedness Index, which aggregates information on friendship ties around the world and helps people better understand social connections, both across individual sort of zip code level boundaries, as well as across international boundaries. And that has been used for everything from trying to understand social connections of diaspora communities, which I know is a topic very relevant for the humanitarian community on the line today, as well as better understanding things like financial flows. Turns out that, Countries that have stronger social ties tend to lend to each other more often, tend to have stronger trade between one another. So pretty far and diverse applications of some of the social connectedness data we have as well. In the context of humanitarian response, one thing that I definitely want to highlight on this call is that we have a really robust partnership with OCHA and the Humanitarian Data Exchange. Something that I'm really proud of about our program is that the majority of the data sets that we provide are completely public and licensed under the Creative Commons. My team actually sits within the privacy and data policy organization at Facebook, which means the privacy by design approach we take is front and center to the data sets we build. And a benefit of that is that if you're using tools like differential privacy, which we do, that completely make a data set robust from re-identification, you can make that data set public, and the risk of sort of any privacy invasion will be very, very low. And that's, I'll get to this sort of hopefully later in the more sort of discussion-based setting, but that's something I really firmly believe in. I think in the data for good space and the data sharing space, we've all gotten way too obsessed with legal agreements and paper that facilitates these relationships. And I think that more and more we can all push our data sets to open source platforms and have them be completely devoid of legal agreements. The impact and the use just goes through the roof. And I'm a really big believer in that approach. And we're very grateful to OCHA and HDX for helping us reach the right community of data users for our public data sets. Just to highlight some additional data sets that I think are really powerful in the humanitarian context. Very few people know this, but Facebook actually builds some of the world's most accurate population density maps. And this is not actually built using Facebook data. So in the early days of our connectivity program, there was a group of people who were trying to expand internet access in some of the poorest countries in the world at Facebook, who realized that even population information on where people were sufficient to make good infrastructure investments was pretty poor. And so because Facebook has the resources to do so, we ended up working with CSUN out of Columbia University to buy the entire world's worth of satellite imagery from a company previously known as Digital Globe, now known as Maxar. And we used artificial intelligence to identify structures in that satellite imagery, which helped us create much more fine-grained estimates on where people actually were on planet Earth than a census data set. Because as you can imagine, sort of census tracts are these kind of larger polygons. And if you're using census information, you're going to see that there's 10,000 people living in an area that's this big. If you're using satellite imagery and you're drilling down to what's called a tile level, you're able to say, this area is a farmland, this area has a house in it, so we actually estimate that people are living here. Well, why is this important from a humanitarian context? I mean, accurate population data is probably the backbone of every sort of social intervention you can imagine. But a few good examples of where this data has been used in sort of more fragile context has been in the Central African Republic. We're partners with the International Medical Corps, who has been able to speed up the identification of their service locations by 13 times. Using this population data, they're much more easily able to verify the population of the areas they serve and to verify the service locations, things like health facilities, using our gridded population estimates. And that means in the setting like the Central African Republic, where they're trying to reach 1.1 million people with things like health services or sort of support to vulnerable communities, they can do that service delivery much more quickly. There's also a really interesting application of our high resolution population density maps in Kenya, when a group called Cadasta worked with another group called Pamoja Trust in collaboration with Amnesty International, that found the government had planned actually demolition of a number of areas to do construction where people were actually living. And so they were able to use our population density maps again, because it's so fine grained. Reminder that this is not, again, based on population data, it's based on satellite, Facebook data, it's based on satellite imagery and census information. They were able to show that where there was planned demolition, there would be upwards of 70,000 people displaced by this construction. And so they used our maps to basically show these populations were ultimately at risk of losing their homes and being displaced as a result of the planned infrastructure changes. And they were able to halt construction as a result of this sort of data-based set of insights and analysis. So I think these are just a few examples of some of the data sets that we have and how they can be useful in humanitarian settings. And I would just say, I'll leave you all with one final ask, that if you aren't familiar with our page on Humanitarian Data Exchange, you can simply go there and search for Facebook. We have, I think it's over 200 data sets posted there. And I would love for members of this call and this community to engage more with the tools that we have and provide us feedback if you're interested. I will pass it back to Nikita.
Thanks so much for that, Laura. It's really exciting to hear sort of the speed with which some of those identifications can take place based on the work. So thanks for that overview and those highlights. I will turn it over to Rakesh to tell us about his work at salesforce.org.
Hi there. Thanks so much. My name is Rakesh Bharani. I'm the Director of Humanitarian Impact Data at Salesforce.org. I have about 27 years of experience in humanitarian context, on the ground as also as remote, both in natural disasters contexts such as hurricanes, earthquakes, etc., but also in conflict contexts. And so what I do at Salesforce.org is I lead a lot of our strategy and engagement with the global humanitarian community, as well as with our partners in the tech sector. So for example, with the WHO Tech Task Force on COVID-19 and how technology is being brought to bear around the pandemic. From a Salesforce perspective, we start off with a set of first principles. We take a rights-based approach towards engaging with the sector because we are very, very aware that at the other end of all these data sets are incredibly vulnerable people. We start off with this notion of three main topics. One is that sector action is principled, right? Humanity, neutrality, independence. And as a private sector partner to the sector, we want to make sure that we maintain that integrity and that we don't intentionally or unintentionally put our fingers on the scales in that regard. The second thing is that data is always about people. Even machine data or aggregate data that we may think has no relationship to a human being, if you walk the chain back at some level, it'll always come back to human beings. And the third thing is that data is always a form of power. And to be honest, in Silicon Valley, technologists often wrestle with that notion, right? As computer scientists, we're not necessarily trained to think about data as a form of power, but we lead with that and this notion that you can't just have innovation without risk reduction. Those two things must go hand in hand. Now, we take this sense because we recognize that people are intrinsically vulnerable. The internet has created all these new ways to have connections with the world. And it includes people in humanitarian crises. But with that opportunity, the internet has enabled new and innovative ways to harm people in communities. And I would say that the threat actors in this space are several steps ahead of the humanitarian community, right? So these threat actors are often well-resourced, they are well-financed, and they have real incentives. And I can talk a little bit later about some of the things that we've seen in Syria, in the Syria context, for example. And so we lead with this idea that we have a moral and ethical duty to protect vulnerable people from direct harm from the use of these technologies. Now, when I talk to our colleagues in the tech sector, one of the things that we emphasize is that protection is fundamentally more complicated in a conflict context. It's more than just your typical enterprise safety and security concerns around technology. And I think that some of these trends have been accelerated through COVID-19. So for example, many international humanitarian organizations were essentially forced into an unplanned digital transformation when the pandemic broke out. Right, organizations that were used to pen and paper processes and face-to-face meetings suddenly had to go digital. We have this notion of both formal and informal actors in the sector, whether they are, non-state armed groups, or whether they are private sector tech organizations coming into humanitarian contexts. And then the dynamic of crisis situations themselves. When you're responding to a real-world event on the ground, often digital protections are one of the first things that people forget about. And that the nature of threats, yes, they include digital attacks like, theft of personal information and such things, but they also include things like privacy harms. They open people up in communities up to disinformation and manipulation of narratives. For humanitarian organizations, we've seen threats to operational security or OPSEC. And ultimately, physical harms. When I was working on the ground in Greece in 2015, working on connecting up the Syrian and Afghan refugees at that time, our worst case scenario was that someone would get their smartphone hacked in Greece, and then because of that, a bomb would get dropped on somebody in Aleppo because of it. And so when we talk to our colleagues in the tech sector, in the private sector, one of the things that we think about is like, look, physical harms are real here. They may seem like hyperbole in other contexts, but here they are a real and true concern. And that they go beyond just GDPR type privacy concerns, or, typically when you talk to privacy organizations, they're thinking about from a compliance lens, right? So CCPA in California, or GDPR, or sort of other equivalencies. And even aggregate data that would normally be considered out of scope in a compliance regulatory kind of lens can be used to harm people in a humanitarian conflict lens. So for example, aggregate data, like if I'm an armed group and I know that 80% of the people in a particular village are of a certain sectarian or ethnic group, that's enough for targeting purposes, right? So the harms can still be manifest, even though that data set may be considered, aggregated and otherwise out of scope from a regulatory compliance lens. Another challenge that we find in this space is that, if data is about power, the humanitarian context itself is fundamentally coercive, right? Like if you're a refugee coming up to a refugee camp and there's someone there with a laptop and an iris scanner saying, I need to get your biometric data to register you. If I want a safe place for my kids to sleep that night, I'm probably going to give that data over uncritically, without any sort of understanding about how that data may be used or reused. And in fact, looking at the recent Human Rights Watch report on UNHCR data collection in the Myanmar, in the Rohingya camps in Bangladesh, the consent language was presented to people in English with the boxes pre-ticked. And then it turns out that data was handed right back to the government in Myanmar that's been complicit in the genocide. And so there are many, many harms there. And so these things really do happen in this notion. And then there are other things that we at Salesforce are very mindful of. We are very mindful of the fact that there's an inherent tension between, we're a CRM company, we're a database, so collecting all this data, or, if you listen to our marketing language, there's this notion of customer 360. But is there fundamentally a tension between customer 360 and what people have called surveillance humanitarianism? Yeah, there is a tension there. We have to wrestle with it. Most of the big tech companies that are coming into humanitarian contexts are American or European. Most of the work is in the global South. And so how do we fundamentally avoid creating historic power imbalances or digital colonialism, where the value of data is basically being extracted out of these contexts, but not necessarily coming back in benefit to those people on the ground? And then the last thing that we think about are how to engage in this space as a respectful member of the community. Many of the largest tech organizations, including Salesforce, have, in some ways comparable power to states. And so what do ethical collaborations between the international humanitarian community and these large tech companies look like? And how should that conversation evolve? And so we come at this with a fundamentally intersectional lens. And then, when you think about the Afghanistan context just recently, where biometric databases are believed to have been captured by the Taliban. And now, this data that was used for one purpose may very well be repurposed as essentially a kill list. And so, as a tech company, as an entity that comes into these conversations, what are our obligations to help inform our implementing customers, the humanitarian communities, about how they should be thinking about this data, how they should be protecting this data, and making sure they fully understand the various protection mechanisms that exist in our platforms and our technologies that they ought to be thinking about. And so I'm really glad to be a part of this conversation and to help kind of share our point of view with all of the humanitarians here on the call, and as with yourself, Nikita and Laura. So thanks so much.
Thanks very much for that, Rakesh. Just to recap for those who joined in the midst of the last two interventions, we are getting an overview of the work of Laura and Rakesh, and also taking questions currently in the chat for our Q&A section later. So please keep those. I see a few of them coming in. I wanted to follow up on some of the last remarks that were made, and want to thank you both also for pulling back the curtain a bit on your backgrounds and your motivations for engaging in this type of work. You both alluded to perhaps how your answer to this next question might have been different prior to the COVID-19 pandemic and its start, but thinking about sort of the assumptions and ingoing hypotheses that tech companies might be making with regard to neutrality and balance and safety and respect for the populations that they are intending to serve, or the partners that they are hoping to collaborate with. What do you currently see as the biggest challenges when it comes to humanitarian and peace building efforts, where the private sector's responsible use of emerging technologies and data-driven approaches to increase impact may be challenging? And on the flip side of that, are there opportunities that are presenting themselves in the wake of the challenges that maybe recent events have revealed to those working in this space?
Sure, I'm happy to jump in. I mean, I think the challenges I always see are getting data used by the right people. And I actually don't think volume of usage is an issue for us anymore. So for example, like our publicly available data sets were downloaded 1.7 million times this year. That's a lot for bespoke, non-traditional data. That being said, when we look at the applications of these data, there does tend to be a much stronger bend towards academic research rather than sort of humanitarian or nonprofit operations. And my goal is to actually impact communities on the ground, change decision-making, change resource allocation in a more equitable, accurate, and sort of real-time way. And it's great to have academics around the world use our data and show in every country around the world, for example, that physical distancing was adopted more in high-income settings, and that it's much harder to stay home if you're poor. That's an important implication, but if that doesn't change the way we implement physical distancing or lockdown policies, if that doesn't change the way we support poor populations to be able to stay home, we do have some examples of that. Some of our mobility data, for example, in India was shown to substantiate the nutritional assistance policy they had. So when they found that poorer populations weren't staying home as regularly, there was a desire to actually make nutritional assistance more readily available as a way potentially to have populations not have to travel to get food. And in that case, our mobility data showed that that policy was effective. So I would just say more and more our team is trying to make sure that our data is not just getting used, but it's getting used by the right people who are actually doing on the ground operations and making decisions in real time. And then on the opportunity side, I mean, I think the opportunities are kind of endless. I think one really interesting transition our program has experienced as a result of the pandemic is being kind of like a series of nice to have insights as opposed to being sort of mission critical. So two examples of this. I know that it's hard to imagine, but for the first year of the pandemic, we did not have vaccines. And so the two major ways in which people were trying to get a handle on prevention measures was trying to measure if populations were staying home and whether or not people were wearing masks. And those were two things you couldn't measure with administrative data. I mean, what were you supposed to do? Like public health officials can look out their window and roughly see if there are people on the street. I mean, I even saw proposals that you could use things like CCTV footage to try to have a random sample of whether or not the population on walking down the street was wearing a mask. But in our case, mobility data from Facebook, again, alongside other tech companies as well, Google publishes their own mobility data, so does Apple. We saw sort of all three of those data sets become the go-to information source for measuring the effectiveness of lockdown orders and the adherence to those policies around the world. And then on mask wearing data, we had a huge global survey that we launched with the University of Maryland and Carnegie Mellon that asked in 200 countries and territories in 55 languages every single day, a sample of in the United States alone was 50,000 people per day. So I think every day was 100,000 people or so around the world were answering the survey. Asked them a number of questions around COVID, including, do you regularly wear a mask? And that survey became the go-to information source on mask wearing worldwide. Was used by, and is still used by the Institute of Health Metrics and Evaluation, which is the go-to COVID forecaster in the world, is used by almost every country on planet Earth to better understand what COVID is likely to look in their country. So I just think from an opportunities perspective, now that we're all in a place where data sets from tech companies are sort of front and center of the decision-making mix, how do we continue to make that case? How do we continue to sort of make tools that are equally valuable as we continue to combat COVID worldwide? How do we make tools that are equally valuable for addressing the threats of climate change? Now that we're all growing increasingly comfortable, I think, as a community with using non-traditional data, how do we just keep making sure that we're building the right things and getting them into the right hands? And I'll pass it over to Rakesh.
No, that's terrific. And I think one distinction that I make for the audience here is that, as Salesforce, it's not our data, right? So we are a SaaS company. We provide software services to customer organizations, which are in this case humanitarian organizations. So the kind of data that Meta would have or Google would have versus the kind of conversations and tooling that we provide are sort of different categories, but they're obviously mutually compatible or mutually complementary. The way that we look at this is that this is actually not a trend that started with COVID-19. There has been an emerging paradigm where NGOs and humanitarian organizations are basically taking in revenue and resources and turning those things into impact on the ground in their missions. And, in the 150 years of the modern humanitarian system, there's been this long-term trend of focusing less on good intentions, right? We're humanitarians, we're here to help, give us money and let us go do our thing, but really being able to demonstrate impact. And that the idea is that as the sector becomes more impact driven, impact will then hopefully turn into more revenue and resources to go continue and do those things. And that this trend really happened starting in the modern sense with the World Humanitarian Summit back in 2016 and the Grand Bargain, right? So the Grand Bargain was a major agreement between the major donor governments, keeping in mind that 80% of the sector's funding comes from governments like USAID and FCDO and et cetera. And some of the largest humanitarian organizations, both within the UN system as well as with the international community. And of course, just in recent years, in 2018, FCDO released their digital strategy. In April of 2020, USAID released their digital strategy. And all of these digital strategies emphasize the continued importance of being data-driven and evidence-based in what organizations are doing. And so as the funding becomes more tied to evidence of impact with things like the Grand Bargain, or even in subsectors like the Joining Forces Initiative, which is focused on child-focused organizations, the whole sector is moving towards being data-driven. And that, to Laura's point, COVID-19 really only accelerated that dynamic. So I would say that COVID-19 did not start this, but it has certainly accelerated it in a way that I don't think would have happened for a number of other additional years outside of the pandemic. But what we're talking about here is really in the peace context and in the conflict context. And what does this mean in conflict environments where you actually are not dealing with natural disasters, but you're actually talking about state or non-state armed groups in a human conflict? And of course, in a human conflict context, what we've seen is that really with the start of the Ukraine conflict with Ukraine and Russia, and the Syrian conflict really accelerating in 2015, we started to see that digital threats just become one additional dimension of the armed conflict. And that, Citizen Lab at the University of Toronto documented that humanitarian organizations were one of the 4 main targeted organizations around the Syrian conflict, right? So we know, and it's been well documented, that humanitarian organizations and the data that they collect and are entrusted with is a factor or is a target. And so just looking at Syria, for example, every side of the Syrian conflict had some sort of cyber dimension or cyber capability, whether you're talking about the Assad regime, the Russians, the Western forces, or the non-state groups like ISIS. All of these organizations had cyber dimensions to what they were doing. And, you know, because it's the internet, that wasn't just limited to the geographic boundaries of Syria and its conflict, right? So we saw this happening. And in fact, we're seeing this happening today in contexts like the Ethiopian conflict right now, and with regards to Tigray, right? This is happening today. And so one of the things that we did in July is we published a guide for how to secure and some of the considerations for data security and data security contexts in conflict environments. So for example, when you're responding to a natural disaster, this may be less needing, you may need to do this less, but certainly in a conflict context, the humanitarian community needs to really think about how to bring together its physical security protocols and its digital security protocols. Today, generally speaking, these exist in different spheres of action. But if I were just to look at Afghanistan as one example, a degradation in the physical security situation on the ground should have triggered digital security responses like delete your data, wipe your devices, make sure you're securing all that data and you're not just leaving it out there to be captured by the armed groups. For the most part, this did not happen in Afghanistan when the Taliban took over in Kabul. And so right now, one of the things that we need to do is we need to drive conversations between things like the protection cluster and the emergency telecommunications cluster. Right now, cyber capabilities are not really triggered by events on the ground. And in a fragile context where a degradation of the physical security environment can do this, where that there are emerging conversations that I think that we need to drive. The one last thing that I would say is that if I were to say, when did the private sector tech community really start to engage in humanitarian action as de facto humanitarian actors themselves, as opposed to just tech vendors? I would say that there was Haiti in 2010 during the response of the earthquake there. But even to this day, there are no generally accepted principles or practices for what constitutes a good public-private partnership in a conflict context. And so you do have organizations, the big tech companies, of which we're representatives of here, but what those practices look like in, so for example, there's no guidance in Sphere about what this ought to look like, the Sphere handbook around humanitarian action, or other data protection guidelines documents that exist. There are many from USAID and ICRC and others, but they fundamentally do not have guidance today about what do ethical and protective private sector partnerships look like. And when we engage in these conversations, especially around conflict conversations, it's really weird because sometimes we as the private sector partner are driving very hard conversations that really belong centered in the humanitarian community. I mean, I suppose it's a good thing that we're at least self-aware of these things, but I would really encourage the humanitarian community to drive a set of conversations about what do ethical and protective partnerships with the private sector tech community look like, because fundamentally the mission is not ours, it's yours. And so we are in support of the mission on the ground. And so it's a little like the tail wagging the dog when we're the ones driving the conversation. And so I would love to engage in like developing these practices and principles, but we as the tech company shouldn't be the ones setting those practices out. So I hope from this kind of conversation and subsequent conversations that those practices emerge, but they are a gap that exists today. Thanks.
Thanks so much for that, Rakesh. I think you raised a number of points that come up in the data for good space in general with regard to whose role it really should be to set those standards and how to engage the communities who are impacted by those standards and data collection and data use practices. And definitely see some comments here in the chat also echoing that sentiment. I have one more question for you both before we turn to the questions in the chat, and that's really, you've both provided sort of examples from a wealth of experience and perspective related to this work. A lot of tensions surfacing between confidence in data approaches, negative externalities related to types of data that are being collected and used in different contexts. Curious to hear what you would say are the key lessons you've learned about private sector partnerships in this space, and where you would say, and I know Rakesh, you were just alluding to this in your last comments, but where do we need to go from here?
Laura, I'll let you speak to that first, please.
Oh, sure. Sorry, I wasn't sure if we were going to switch it up. You know, this is hard. I mean, I see some of the specific questions around sort of data protection of vulnerable groups. And I think just at a high level, that has to be part of the design process. You know, and I'm happy to talk more about how we think about that on our team. It's a very, very central part of how we build tools. And so when I think, you know, when you get all the way to releasing a data set, and keep in mind, our program doesn't really release data that, you know, we actually don't typically release any data for active zones of active conflict. And then we also don't have data sets that identify things like ethnicity or vulnerable groups. All that being said, you know, you still have to have a very mindful approach. While the vast majority of our data set is public, we do have a number of data sets that are called controlled access, and which is one way of sort of mitigating any misuse of a data set, is to sign a data license agreement with a specific actor that's vetted, that's doing work that you understand deeply. So for example, not every country of the high resolution settlement layer, our population density maps, is public. And so for countries like Syria, it's a controlled access data set, and we actually vet the partners who download the population data for that setting. So I certainly think there's sort of data access and control policies you can have. But I'll just leave with, you know, one of the feelings I have of having worked in this space for some time is that, you know, we talk about a lot of the risk of using data. And this is a sort of motto that comes from Robert Kirkpatrick, who runs UN Global Pulse. You know, he often says that it's about the misuse of data that we're not talking about enough. So we spend so much time talking about adversarial use and misuse of data, and sort of not protecting privacy, not protecting vulnerable populations. And what I'm always left wondering is, yeah, but what about not using data to support those vulnerable populations? What about not targeting your interventions to those populations based on the fact that you weren't pushing to get the right data? A very simple example of this we've built something called the Relative Wealth Index, which is a very fine-grained set of wealth and poverty estimates that use satellite imagery, and it's trained on demographic and health survey data from USAID. But it leverages a bunch of information that's non-traditional, including de-identified connectivity information from Facebook that tends to be pretty predictive, actually, of where poor people live. And something that I learned through that process is that even if you have a relatively up-to-date census or DHS data set, it's sampled from a small minority of the population. So you could cover really 10% of geographic boundaries, even if you have a nationally representative sample. And so when you're doing something like targeting a social protection program, you're making decisions based on sampling that could cover, you know, less than 10% of the population, and you could really be missing a pretty significant portion of the truly poor if that data is used by itself. But conversely, if you were to look at, you know, if you were to treat a data set built by a company like ours with so much suspicion and risk aversion, you could actually be at risk of reaching more wealthy people if using administrative data on its own. So I think you have to be really careful. I think you have to balance these misuse, sort of adversarial use, data protection questions with, what about just getting our program wrong, and what would be the downstream impacts of that? And I'll pass it over to Rakesh.
No, I totally agree with that, and that there's fundamentally, you know, when we choose to do things, we're choosing not to do everything else we could be doing, right? So economists would call this an opportunity cost, right? So if we choose not to use data, then we run into a whole other list of potential harms. And the easiest example I can think about off the top of my head would be actually, this predates the modern use of the internet in humanitarian affairs, but Goma in 1994 as an impact of the Rwandan genocide, where the media were in a certain area, and so that's where the aid went. Whereas all these other populations who were in much greater need, but because it wasn't on CNN, they were essentially ignored, right? And I mean, this is where Sphere came from and all these other reforms in the sector. But certainly we don't want to repeat, that kind of decision-making problem in modern humanitarian response. And it's obviously to Laura's point, data is about if data is always about people, then whose stories get told, and more importantly, perhaps whose stories are not getting told in that data is really, really important. And I'll give you two examples about where this kind of public-private partnership can be tricky and where I think capacities need to be built. Several years ago, while working in a conflict context, I was approached personally by a representative from a government's intelligence agency. And we had just deployed Wi-Fi networks for vulnerable people in the country. And they said, and this is very shortly after the Paris terrorist attacks in 2015. So, the awareness or sensitivities around this kind of thing was very high at that point. And the request was made to tap the wireless networks so that the host government could actually see what these people were actually accessing on the internet. Now, from a network infrastructure standpoint, this is a very easy thing to do. If you're familiar with switching, it's called a span port. It takes about 30 seconds to enable it. It's used all the time for network troubleshooting purposes. Now, as a private sector entity, who had access to the infrastructure, it would have literally taken me about a minute to do this. But being aware of the humanitarian principles, I said, wait a second, this is very questionable. Like, technically very easy to do, but whether it should actually be done, I shouldn't be the one making that decision. And so I went to the humanitarian community who was responsible for that facility, and I said, this is the request we received. What do you want to do about it? In other words, I will do whatever you want me to do because, I can just tap on the keyboard and make it happen. But I should not be the one making that decision. And ultimately, the organization decided that in maintaining the humanitarian principles of neutrality and independence, that it was best to just pull out of the country altogether. And so that was what the decision was made, was that instead of facilitating the wiretap, it was best to just, pull the plug on the whole thing altogether. Now, that was one example of this. Another example was really designing cybersecurity for conflict contexts and understanding that armed groups are likely to come after these populations in digital protection spheres, and to really design it intentionally with this. Now, the reason why I cite these two examples is because in both of these cases, private sector organizations, in the latter case, it was Google and Cisco, realized that there was intrinsically a higher sensitivity to this kind of work. Humanitarians did not ask us of this. We put it on ourselves. And so I do think that there is a capacity for engaging the private sector where you need to be able to engage the private sector and help them be better partners in these kind of contexts. Because you can't guarantee that the person you're sitting across the table from in Silicon Valley has any idea of these contexts, right? A lot of people in Silicon Valley who work in the social impact or blank for good space, they truly want to do good. But, I would say that Laura and I are actually kind of outliers. We don't have, most people in Silicon Valley who work in this space do not have the mission context. And so you cannot assume that they will automatically cue into these issues. So I would say that one ask for the community is to help the tech sector get better at engaging in these conversations. Help inform us about your principles and your practices and what your concerns are, and help us be better partners. So that's the one thing. The other thing is accountability. a number of humanitarian organizations enjoy privileges and immunities under international humanitarian law. So the coercive stick of things like GDPR or other national data protection laws don't apply to them. Now, there are very good reasons for privileges and immunities under international humanitarian law for, Geneva Conventions and other good reasons. But one effect that I've seen in the real world is that it gives certain humanitarian organizations a pass in cleaning up their own data practices because they don't have to disclose. They aren't subject to fines. They can, in other words, they can go, oops, and then just sweep it under the rug, and there's no accountability to the data subjects for data harms. And of course, when you're talking about big tech companies, how do we make sure that there's transparency and accountability for these public-private partnerships? One thing I'll highlight is the outcry that happened a couple of years ago when the WFP Palantir deal came out. What were the protections in place, and who had transparency and sunlight into that? And that was a big point of contention for the community. And so what I would say is I really want the organizations to hold me to account. I want accountability. I want transparency in how we engage here. But, as a private sector representative, it would be a little self-serving if I came up with the mechanisms for that, right? So I really do want to engage both with the academic community and the private sector community around accountability for engaging, especially in fragile contexts, because the average data subject on the ground in these conflict situations in Syria or Yemen or whatever, their ability to hold a Meta or an Amazon or a Salesforce to account is virtually nil. So where does the accountability come from? And I'll just put that to the audience, like, let's engage in this conversation.
Thanks for that, Rakesh. And seeing some reactions in the chat to what both of you have just shared. There's definitely this issue of data literacy that comes up again frequently in our space. There's also the issue of sort of context literacy and issue literacy from the standpoint of what needs to be translated between these two partners in order to really understand the best ways to approach an issue. I want to move to sort of the Q&A that's been coming through in the chat. Appreciation to all in the audience who are engaging there. Perhaps the first question that we should take, this is actually directed, I think, to you, Laura, from Paige at CIC, asking, I would be interested to hear more highlights on some of the Facebook data sets on the HDX platform, particularly as they may be relevant to understanding conflict dynamics. The example Laura gave earlier about using the density maps to prevent displacement is relevant in general, but specifically relevant if the data also includes ethnic or gender dimensions. Laura, do you have any thoughts on this off the top of your head?
Sure. Yeah. So our high resolution population density maps are, one of the fully public data sets on HDX available for over 150 countries. They do not include ethnic information or anything related to sort of religious affiliation. Again, the base data sets that we're pulling from in this case are satellite imagery and census information. We do have a number, however, of what we call demographic breakdowns that were built collaboratively with the humanitarian community. So we do have basic breakdowns for a number of categories, like what do we think the distribution of the male population is? What do we think the distribution of the female population is? Youth, elderly, children under 5, and then women of reproductive age. So certainly I would say useful for better understanding overall population dynamics, but nothing sort of revealing of sensitive groups or ethnicities there. I would say a few other data sets that are available on Humanitarian Data Exchange that would be useful to this community include the Social Connectedness Index that I mentioned. Again, this is pretty novel to try to use information on social ties, but you can imagine if you're trying to support displaced communities, refugee populations, it's really helpful to know, for example, what parts of the United States have sort of high proportions of social connections with Syria, Afghanistan. It's not going to tell you anything about where people have actually ended up, but it's likely that communities with a high density of social connections to a fragile zone are going to be communities potentially where refugees could end up, or potentially that would be sending money to these communities overseas. And so I think the data on sort of social connections could be really valuable for this group as well. And finally, we have, I mentioned this during the talk, but a set of mobility insights called movement range maps. The primary use case for this is COVID-19 response. We basically look at trends in overall mobility by subnational area, so either county or sort of equivalent in about 150 countries around the world. But mobility data is one of those very fungible things. We've seen this used for economic forecasting in Indonesia by our partners at CSIS. And we've seen this used to better understand innovations in sort of transport infrastructure in Europe. And I can imagine that if there was a desire by this community to use that mobility data to better understand population flows for other purposes. They don't cross boundaries, international boundaries, so that's a caveat. But sort of internal mobility, it might be a good data set for understanding some of that.
Thanks, Laura. Time, it looks like, for maybe one more question. This appears to be open to the both of you. To Rakesh's earlier point that adding dimensions related to conflict dynamics like ethnicity to density maps may actually create the potential for targeting or harm, what are some of the more concrete ways to deal with this challenge? We value open data, yes, but for it to be useful to answer certain questions, it would need to have dimensions relevant to conflict dynamics. Any thoughts?
Yeah, I've seen this. I've seen this play out a couple of times in various responses. So back in 2011 in Northwest Pakistan, there was a series of massive floods. And in that context, Carnegie Mellon University held a hackathon to do some mapping to figure out where relief supplies and other things were going and other such things. And you have to understand, in early mid 2011, a lot of people had just come out of the Haiti response, which was a very different context, right? It wasn't a conflict context. It was a natural disaster. And so a lot of the crowdsourcing community that was working on this were, really proponents of open data and everything. And one of the questions, I came into this conversation and I asked them, okay, how are you protecting this data? Well, we don't know. It's meant to be open. This is to the world. It's open source and all that sort of thing. And I said, well, you do realize that there is also a conflict going on in Northwest Pakistan, in addition to the natural disaster. And what you've just done is developed a targeting lens. And we also saw this in the Libyan civil war around that same time during the Arab Spring. And so one of the really important things that I think is a takeaway here is that your technologists need to have context awareness. They absolutely need to have context awareness, in that they can't be, for lack of a better term, fighting the last war, which, like responding to a wildfire in the United States with data and responding to Yemen are very different things. And to understand how they are different, and they have to be informed not just by the technologists, but also by people who actually understand that context. Derrida said, the philosopher Derrida said that context is everything, and I'm kind of a big believer in that. I do think that understanding and building those communities of practice, like OCHA's HDX and the conversations that they're convening, it's really important to bring the private sector entities into those rooms as early as possible, because for all the conflicts and crises I've been a part of, every crisis that I will be responding to for the rest of my career are yet to be in the future. And so, the best time to have this conversation would have been about 12 years ago, but the second best time to have this conversation is right now. And we need to get, like these conversations in place, because otherwise we default to almost like these kind of hackathon mentalities where it's about moving fast and the kind of more nuanced conversations are easy to get lost in those environments. And I'll just cite my own work around Afghanistan. The article that we published around best practices for conflict contexts was spurred by the Taliban takeover. Well, I mean, to be honest, writing the article after the takeover has happened is it a little bit too late for that situation, right? The harms have already been committed, or are now out of your control. And so I think that the earlier that you can bring the private sector in, because I mean, to be honest, we have really smart people and world-class technologies. What we do not have is context. What we do not have is an understanding of the mission and impact, because that's not our role in this. That's really yours as humanitarians. And so the earlier that we can have informed conversations and come up with the appropriate protective lenses is going to be good for everybody, because climate change and COVID-19 are fundamentally destabilizing forces, right? We saw extreme poverty go up for the first time since 1998 last year. And so, it is reasonable to assume that there will be additional conflicts in the future, and that we need to get ready for this now. And we need to be on trying to do whatever we can to get ahead of this curve, knowing that we're already kind of playing catch up. Thanks.
So we are getting very close to time. I don't know, Laura, if you had any quick responses to the last question as well.
Sure. I mean, I think as kind of closing remarks, I first of all really appreciate this conversation. Again, although our program doesn't, specifically work in active conflict situations, we are always trying to ship value to this community and make sure that our tools are useful for humanitarians around the world. And so just really appreciate the time and the feedback. One thing I'll say is that, I think humility is really important, and it's something that I try to bring every day to my work. And I think that is true, really important as a factor when we think about the power of data. I think that data from groups like Meta and Facebook is not a panacea. And importantly, it's not treated as such by our partners. So I think, when we talk about the kind of data sets that our team is trying to build, it's typically trying to answer pretty big foundational questions. Where are there people on planet Earth? Where are people poor or rich? How many men versus women? Are people moving or not? Are people staying at home or not? And that has ended up working out well for our team, because first of all, it's very good for privacy preservation when you're trying to answer those big aggregated sort of population-based questions. And it also means that that data is going to be insufficient to answer very specific targeted questions. And so what I find really exciting about the community that we work with is that, I think data from groups like Facebook or Google or any other sort of non-traditional data source work best when used in tandem with a bunch of other insights. Bring it in and compare it to administrative data. Bring it in with data from other tech companies. We see our mobility data used alongside Google and Apple's all the time. And we like that because we represent different populations. I think a really good example of this is when our tool, the Relative Wealth Index, was recently used to expand a social protection scheme in Togo, in collaboration with UC Berkeley, the government of Togo, and a team called Give Directly, which provides unconditional cash transfers. They used the Relative Wealth Index for sort of high-level targeting, but then they had to use other data for individual eligibility. Our map on sort of where poor people were, broadly speaking, was not going to tell them, nor did we want it to, what individual household to provide a cash subsidy to. And that's really, I think, where we feel best positioned to be helpful and most comfortable being helpful is providing sort of high-level directional guidance for program design, but then really relying on the data of our partners and other data sources to make tailored decisions, hopefully that are better informed by our data as one piece of the decision-making puzzle, but never all of it.
Thanks so much for that, Laura. I think we are just about at time. Rakesh, were you about to say something?
Yeah, no, I mean, I think that from our perspective, it's really, we got to do two things. We got to lead with impact and focus on the technological use on how it actually moves the needle in the moments and places where the work gets done. But we also have to have a lens of data responsibility, which basically is about human dignity, right? So, and when I think about dignity, I think about safety, security, opportunity, and agency, and how do we sustain and maintain those things, especially in fragile contexts. And from my perspective, and what I tell our colleagues inside of Salesforce who work in this space, is that we have to get this right. There is no way to accelerate our impact without doing right by people. And again, ultimately, this comes back to people and how they are protected by the work that we're doing, and our understanding that we have an obligation to think about that. And so I appreciate the conversation. I appreciate the dialogue here, and thank the audience and thank Laura and you yourself, Nikita. Thank you.
Thanks so much, both. We are at time. It's probably a heavy spot to land on. A lot of responsibility, accountability, obligation on both sides. Data literacy, context awareness. I want to once again thank Rakesh and Laura for their time. Also, the technical moderators, interpreters, and everyone in the audience for spending the last 60 minutes with us together. Wish you all a good rest of your morning, afternoon, and evening, and look forward to the next opportunity to engage. Thanks, everyone.